Hi, and welcome to the Research Like a Pro question and answer series. A question that we get all the time in our Research Like a Pro study group and e-course is how to know if you've met the genealogical proof standard. So Diana will use the member of our Research Like a Pro study group, their question, and she'll discuss ideas for getting closer to meeting the proof standard, the 5 elements of genealogical proof, and some strategies to record negative evidence and negative searches to show reasonably exhaustive research, talking about writing it up, and all of the elements that are needed to feel like you've gotten closer or met the genealogical proof standard.
So the question comes up, when have I met proof? And we may have done lots and lots of reports and we feel like we've got enough, but do we have enough? And I think it's awesome that the genealogy community has come together, and this was really started by the Board for Certification of Genealogists, and put together the Genealogical Proof Standard. And so here you see the main points. We've probably heard this before, but this gives us such a good, solid idea of if we have done enough. So, reasonably exhaustive research, which means that we have really tackled all the sources that could give us evidence for our research question. So, it really comes down to what we are trying to find out. And so, for instance, if we're trying to find out a birth record, we want to make sure we have covered all the sources that could give us birth information. And then, of course, we need to have complete, accurate source citations. And these citations would need to describe the record fully and also to enable us or anyone else to get back to the record. We have to be able to test all of the facts. So we've got to make sure we understand the sources and the information, the evidence, and what they are telling us, and then also correlate all of that evidence, putting it all together in a logical format. And then, of course, the conflicts. We're always going to have those, and we've got to somehow resolve those. If we cannot resolve those reasonably, then we probably haven't met proof yet. And then finally, we don't have anything until we write it down. So we've got to get it all in writing. It's got to be soundly reasoned. So it's got to make sense. So this is just things to think about as we're thinking of proof. So there are different types of written proofs. And I have got Tom Jones' book here, Mastering Genealogical Proof. He basically takes what's written in genealogy standards and expands it for the whole idea of proof. And he talks about each of the types of written proofs. So we can have proof statements, and these are usually just 2 or 3 sentences. It's not a lot, but you have direct evidence. There's no known conflicts, and there's at least one original record and one primary information item. And usually we put these in our other written works. We could have these in our research reports or in a case study, anything where we're just stating a fact, such as so and so was born on this date, and we have got a birth certificate, which would be an original record and a primary information item. So, just a pretty simple, direct evidence. But then we might have a proof summary where we need to add a little bit more. We can't just make one statement. We've got to add more evidence to it. Again, it is direct evidence, and this is something that could be in a report, it could be in a case study or any other written work, and it can stand alone. Your proof statement has to be included with something else. And then if you do have some conflicting evidence, you can resolve it with just a few paragraphs or pages. So you can figure this out. This isn't a really difficult case to write up, a proof summary, but a proof argument is more difficult. This would be a complex case. This is perhaps where you're trying to sort out somebody's identity in case you've got people of the same name, or you're just trying to sort out who they really are. Or you might have a lot of conflicting evidence and you simply have got to take care of all that, resolve all of that. And it also has indirect evidence. There's not one piece that actually gives you your answer. And when you're writing a proof argument, you've got to really carefully organize it and present your evidence in a way that makes sense for your conclusion. So there are basically three different types of proof, and you can think about maybe how you've used some of these without really knowing what you were doing or putting a label to it. We often do the proof statements, and if you've written a proof argument, you would know because that's a lot of work and it takes some real thinking. So how do these compare, a research report or a proof argument? So here's some thoughts that I had. When we write our reports, they are showing what we found in a specified research phase. So we have a specific objective that we're trying to do in our report. And within our report, we could have some proof statements and some proof summaries, things that we have figured out in the course of the research. We explain what we did before our previous research. We, of course, have our source citations, and then we always have more research we need to do in a research report because we haven't finished the research usually. We may have finished the research, and then in that case, our further research ideas would be maybe to go off on a new objective, perhaps, following one of the fan club or some new tangent that we could do, but we have the basic objective met. So our research report is different from a proof argument. Our proof arguments could incorporate several research phases. So I have done research where I have spent 3 or 4 complete phases and 3 or 4 reports before I finally feel like I have come to proof. And then I have to write something that brings all of that research together. And a proof argument, you can judge if it is done well because you've met the genealogical proof standard. So you've got your reasonably exhaustive research, your complete accurate source citations, your tests of analysis and correlation, your conflict resolution, and your written conclusion. So I think it's really good to sit down and think about where we are with something like this as we're working on our written products, both in a report and a proof argument. So we're going to use a little case study, and this came up from one of our questions. So I'm going to read through this and show you all the different pieces of evidence, and then we're going to see what we think about proof. So I am researching my second great-grandmother, Anne Jensen, who I was unable to find any records for after her immigration to the U.S. in 1882. My hypothesis was that she had remarried and was present in records under a different name. I've been able to identify a likely match and have collected several sources with indirect evidence, census and newspaper records, and one source that could possibly be considered direct evidence, her husband's obituary, listing her last name at the time of marriage. Still looking for direct evidence such as a marriage record or church records or a death certificate, but haven't been able to find anything yet. My question is, if I'm unable to find direct evidence, how much indirect evidence is needed to write a proof argument? Can I conclude they're the same person, or should I say in my report they're likely the same person? I feel like I need another class to teach me how to write a proof argument. Well, sometimes you might feel like that because it can be challenging, and often you learn the best from just doing. And so we're going to go through and see what we think about this case of the Anne Jensen. All right, so if you're really interested in learning more, then I would suggest you get a hold of Mastering Genealogical Proof by Tom Jones and the Genealogy Standards Second Edition by the Board for Certification of Genealogists. And then whenever a question comes up, you can look it up. I would recommend going through this book because it's sort of a workbook where you learn and then you have questions to answer and you get to actually try to understand with case studies. And so it's a good one to study and use as a course, perhaps, to help you learn how to write. So let's take a look at all the indirect evidence for the Anne Jensen Research Project. So where did Anne Jensen? She's born 16 May 1833 in Denmark, married 6 December 1874 in Copenhagen to Niels Christian Hansen. So where does she live after landing in New York City with her husband and stepdaughter on May 8, 1882? So we're not going to look at the actual records for her birth record, her marriage record, or the immigration record. So just know those are the dates that we've got there. But we're trying to figure out where did she live after coming to the United States? And this can be a challenge, finding an ancestor who has immigrated, figuring out where did they go? Are we connecting the right person in the US with the right person who was in Denmark and landed? So we've got some available evidence we're going to look at. For the first thing, we're not going to look at the immigration record, but just know that it said she was headed to Dayton, Ohio, where her son Rasmus Julius lived. But no other records of her in the U.S. have been found for this Anne Jensen married to a Hansen. So the hypothesis is that her husband died and she remarries, and she would be in the records under a different last name. So you could see the problem here. Anne Hansen, very common names, both surname and first name. So that would be a challenge for one thing, just the naming. Now there's a possible match that we have assembled some evidence for an Anna Nelson who was born 1834. So this is close to 1833, died in 1914, married to a Lars Nelson and living in Beavertown Republic, Kansas until 1911, then dying in Ruskin, Nebraska. So that doesn't necessarily fit the idea that she was going to Ohio. So how can we put all of these things together? Well, let's take a look at some of the evidence. The 1900 census for this Anne Nelson shows her in the household with her husband Lars. And we do have a birthday, month of May, and 1834 is the year, which is off a year from the birth record in Denmark, which was 33. And also notice how much older she is than her husband. She is 22 years older. So they've been married for 13 years. She has 2 children and 2 are living, and she's from Denmark. And over here, the immigration date is 1882, which does match. So several pieces match up here. Just this one date here is a little bit off. So this would be a conflict that we would need to resolve. Now, the 1905 census was a state census, and this one was for Kansas, and they asked, first of all, where your place of birth was. And so here we have Lars, Nelson, and Anna again, and Christina. And she's still, 21 years older there than her husband. So we know this is the same family. And both born in Denmark. Christina's born in Kansas. And where did they come from before they came to Kansas? Well, Lars came straight from Denmark, apparently, to Kansas. And then Anna came from Ohio to Kansas. Now, Ohio is interesting because if you remember, she was going to go to Ohio where her son lived. So just that little piece right there does help us make a connection to the Anna who came from Denmark and we have the immigration record for. Now in 1909, we have got that Mr. and Mrs. James, or probably James Robertson, spent Sunday afternoon at Lars Nelson's in honor of Mrs. Nelson's birthday. And we love these little newspaper clippings in the social columns. So doing some calculation of the date, this was May 20th, 1909, and looking at the calendar for that year, Sunday was May 16th, which is her birthday, May 16th. That's the actual day. So that's another little piece of evidence that's really good. And then we have a marriage in 1909, and this is Lars Nelson's daughter, and she marries Emil Johnson, who is Anne Jensen's son. So we haven't really seen anything about them yet, but they are stepbrother and stepsister that marry. So, there you go. And the license was issued in South Dakota, and they were married by the judge, and then they went ahead and lived in South Dakota. Now in 1910, we have got Lars and Anna, and they are in Kansas. And it says that he's in, let's blow this up a little bit. He's in his second marriage and she is in her third marriage, and she's got 2 sons and 2 living still. Well, the tricky thing here is in doing more research on this, we found that she had 2 sons who were born out of wedlock. And so here she's stating that she's got her, she's married for the third time. So, you know, is everything that we see in a census always completely accurate? Not necessarily. Sometimes people would put something just to make it more comfortable for them. And we also have got a little bit different immigration record over here than was previously recorded. So first of all, she said in 1900 she immigrated in 1882. This looks like she's saying now 1881. So 10 years later, maybe she's forgotten the exact date of her immigration. And so as we get older, sometimes our memory fades of those important dates, and they might be close, but not exactly the same. But she's still 21 years older than her husband. Then we have got a newspaper entry where Lars and Ole Nielsen had taken a trip to South Dakota the latter part of last week, where Mr. Nelson had been to visit a son and daughter. And so this connects the South Dakota couple to Lars Nelson, and that he went to visit the son and daughter. And just one more little piece. And then finally, we have an obituary for Lars. He dies, and the Ruskin Leader, which is out of Nebraska, says that about 3 years later, saying that his first marriage didn't last long, the wife died, and that Mr. Nelson married again to Anna Hansen. Now, if you remember back to when we first started talking, Anna's first marriage was to a Niels Christian Hansen. So she would have been Anna Hansen at the time of her second marriage to Lars Nelson. So this is the first bit we get that connects her really specifically to that earlier, or just to our Anna. And then it states that Anna and Lars' marriage was about 1888. And that correlates with the 1910 census, which states they were in the current marriage for 13 years. And then we find out that Anna died in Ruskin 8 years ago, which would have been about 1915. And so this obituary gives us some really good pieces that pull things together as well. So have we met the genealogical proof standard with this case? So to write this up as a case study, we'd have some things that we would need to do. One would be to show negative searches for Anna. So if we can't find the marriage record for her with Lars, we can't find her death record, we can't find a death certificate. If there's different things we could have done that could have helped us with this case, we would need to do those. And then if they're negative, show negative. And then perhaps we need to research all of the children, the known children, to see if we can make any more connections. So we would have to just make sure that was complete. And then, of course, we'd need the complete accurate source citations. And then we'd want to analyze and correlate all the pieces. So we'd have to look at the sources and each information piece and really prioritize the original sources and primary information. So we've got censuses, which are good original sources, and we've got some newspapers, which, we'd have to look at those and think about what kind of source, what kind of information, but we don't have any derivative sources, that we would want to find originals for at this point. So that's good. And then we have to resolve the conflicts. So we have the conflict of those 3 marriages on the 1910 census. We'd need to resolve that and explain perhaps her motivation in putting that, and maybe, do additional work to explain that. And then also the conflicts in her birth year. So we have the 1834, whereas she has a birth record for 1833. So we would have to pull that together. And conflicts in birth years are, in my opinion, they're not that hard to explain, because we all know that it can be kind of challenging for the right ages to be recorded in things. Sometimes people just didn't remember their ages, or someone else was giving the information, so they guessed. So we do look at all that and try to make sure we have addressed that. And then finally, we have to write something up, putting all the pieces together so that it makes sense and that somebody reading it could, agree with us. Because if they don't agree with us, we'd have to figure out how better to explain that. So hopefully that gives us all some ideas about where we are in our research for each case we're working on and if we are close to meeting the genealogical proof standard. And if we are, then we can go ahead and start writing it up. I have found as I start to write up a proof argument, that's when I find that there are some things I hadn't thought of and I go and research some more, or I find that I need to correlate some things better. So it's a really good way to get started on writing up your case and then see where you're at. See if you agree that you have met proof with, using the genealogical proof standard as your guidelines. So hopefully that helps.